Hey everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Caregiving and Entrepreneurship Reimagined podcast. Y'all, I am buzzing about this episode because I have invited Dr. Natasha Trujillo to the podcast. She is an author, and you can get her book. It's called "And She Was Never the Same: A Multi-Generational Memoir." And guys, it's so good. I am almost all the way through, and we're going to be talking about some of the content from that book because this has a powerful topic that I think we don't talk about enough. On the podcast, we've talked a lot, obviously, about self care and business and just creating systems to manage being a caregiver. But one thing I don't think we talk enough about is the subject of grief and how grief isn't necessarily just when someone passes away. There's all the other elements of grief that happen even when we're caregiving, even from the standpoint of our loved one our loved one's illness progressing and we're having to adjust into more of a primary caregiver role. And for those of you who I know who are entrepreneurs and not first your first skill set is entrepreneurship and not caregiving, it's overwhelming because there's so many new things that you have to learn. So that's why I invite and the grief and the element too with grief is that it has to come out in a healthy way, and you have to face it. And the thing about Natasha's book that I thought was so powerful is just how we are all so different, and how sometimes we don't know how to process grief, and sometimes we do it in an unhealthy way, and we all process grief in a different way, and grief comes in so many different ways, shapes, and forms. So I'm really excited for this episode, and I hope you walk away with some tips and understanding of better understanding of grief, and just to know that you're not alone, because Natasha and I have both had our own walks with grief and caregiving, and we just want to inspire you and encourage you through your own journey, and to do it in a healthy way to where you're not dealing with the added stress and trauma of just not being able to process in a healthy way. So, Natasha, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, I obviously have gotten to know you a little bit from having getting you ready to be on the podcast, but there's so many people who are not acquainted with your work or maybe not have even heard of you before. So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am a counseling and sports psychologist by trade. So I was trained as a general psychologist, so all things mental health. And then I'm also a sports psychologist, so I work primarily with current and former athletes and then people within the athletic community. On the clinical side of things, I specialize in grief and loss, hence the book, and eating disorders, trauma, anxiety and depressive disorders, perfectionism, and then all things performance psychology. I'm based out of Denver, Colorado, but I'm licensed in around 40 states. So I work with people all over the country. I do a lot of individual therapy. I work with some teams and organizations. And I primarily, like I said, work with current and former athletes. I work with a lot of people who have transitioned from being an athlete into other high performance, high stress careers. So really, really love what I do. And of course, the book is kind of a labor of love that extend some of my work because I just felt like there's so much that is, as you said, not talked about when it comes to grief and loss. And so I wanted to create that space and try to add to making some of these more untalkable things a little bit more talkable.
Right. I love that. And just a little disclaimer too. My mother, she has passed on sadly, but she was a licensed marriage and family therapist. And so,
Mm.
for many years. And then my dad was a pastor. So, working with lots of different people through stress and trauma, and then hence why I decided to go into healthcare. And I just love that. I think that's so special that we both have some history or something with that. So I just thought that was kind of neat to learn about you. So let's talk about, I do definitely want to kind of dive into a couple sections of the book because I know every story, Natasha's book, guys, is definitely broken into chapters with different stories. It could be each chapter could be a standalone story or novel in of itself, because I know you just touched the tip of the iceberg, which each of these chapters. But I think for you, most important thing to start with is you, because that kind of correlates to everything with all the other
Mm.
stories, for people who kind of get them in the headspace of the book. So could when I was reading the book, there was one element I really noticed with you is that I thought was so interesting is that you were so you were gifted with just being able to absorb everything so fast, so quick. And you use that as a way to, for the word potential, I remember was just such a big theme
Yeah.
about that. And I hadn't really thought about when you were writing, it was so interesting. I hadn't thought about how strong and how negative sometimes that word potential is if we use it and where we're pressuring somebody the wrong way in their aspirations, whether it's our children or maybe our spouse, that, we're trying to mold them into a model that we think or that we're vicariously trying to live through. Um, but
Yeah.
I think for you, my first question for you is why do you think, or not why, but how has that experience from the time you were small with, being so driven with academics and athletics now impacted your journey with being a counselor? And how are you using the pain points that you learned from those situations into what you do now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helping people achieve and seek balance with that idea of potential, right? My potential, it was used in such an interesting way throughout my life because when I was really young, and the book covers this, but I had a flight for life. And so there was so much potential for my death and for illness. And my family was always so scared, she's going to get sick again and something is going to happen. So it was this potential that created a lot of anxiety and a lot of warning signs and a lot of hypervigilance and really extra care so that things didn't become worse. And then when I got to school, that potential kind of shifted, and although I was still dealing with some of my medical stuff, they did kind of discover, well, teachers discovered, my parents already knew, but I was gifted, and I picked up things really easily, and I really loved to read and to learn. And so as my teachers and as the school became aware of that too, now there's this whole new area of potential where it's like, wow, she can do so many things with this. And then, of course, when that potential gets embedded in you from a very young age, it was strange to have both this negative potential and this positive potential that was talked about so frequently. And I think a lot of that really fueled my perfectionism because, A, if I was going to die young, then I wanted to make sure that I had reached some potential and they weren't just talking about what I could have done. And I don't think I knew that in the moment. That's kind of reflecting back that that was something that was driving me. But then with the perfectionism, it was always like, yes, I have to exceed potential. And then nothing was ever good enough because there was always more potential that you could reach, always more that you could do. And so you're never satisfied and you're always chasing something. And that can be really exhausting and really stressful and become really maladaptive if you don't balance it. So moving all of that into my own life, I do want people to grasp both the gains and the losses to that idea of potential and try to seek balance a little bit. So that, yes, you're still striving, you're still reaching, you're still trying to develop and grow, but also recognize that there are limits to that. And sometimes where you are right now is great, is great. Is not just good enough, but is great. And you are fine and you don't always need to be striving. And I think particularly for your audience being caregivers, that's also, there's a lot of negative potential, right? Caregivers get very fearful, very scared of, ooh, should you be doing that? Maybe we shouldn't do this. But then there's also the potential, oh, they might get better. So there's a lot of hope wrapped up in it. And so I think it's just a really important concept in so
I
many
love
different
I love
ways.
that. I love that. Yeah, because it was interesting as you were talking, we were talking about potential being used in different ways. The other word that came to my mind was fear. There's the potential or fear of it to go better, the pendulum to swing this way, things are going to get better, or the pendulum to swing that way. And that is something I definitely, for me personally in my journey, I've had to really I've really struggled with because with my husband, his illness is so unpredictable. He has epilepsy. And so I never know when he's going to
Yes.
have an episode. And so obviously trying to be calm and keep the house, sane and stress free, hence, quote unquote stress free. Life is
Yeah.
crazy. There's, and then control is the other thing that came up to me because I remember you talked a lot about that in that chapter of the book too about control.
Yes.
So
Yes.
so it's interesting. You have this kind of triangle of there's the potential of things either going good or bad. Then you and because of that potential of it either going bad, you have the fear of worrying about whether it's to the worst case scenario or the best case scenario. And then you have in the third and then in the third there's balance that hangs in there's the balance that hangs in there in the balance. And sometimes it's just really tricky to get there. And I love and balance is something that I talk a lot about with my listeners. I really instill like there needs to be a balance. Yes, I want you to make sure you're prepared for the worst case scenario, but I don't want you to live in that where you're like constantly
Right.
thinking like, oh gosh, I'm gonna need to call 911 in the next 2 minutes. No, just be prepared if you do by having their medical history written and documented and having their rescue medications close by and having all their current contact information and medications ready to go if you do have to go. But don't live in fear. Living in fear doesn't do anybody any
Yes.
good because again, because then it swings that pendulum one way or the
Yes.
other. And just
Yes.
because we're caregivers, I hope you know that. That's why I say that for those who are entrepreneurs, I want you guys to not give up your business. It's possible. Might it be more appropriate in the season of your caregiving journey to pull it back a little bit, maybe not work as many hours and focus on maybe one area and hire some help? Of course, that makes sense. But your business, if there's anything I've learned to maintain that balance, we need outlets. We need healthy outlets to express ourselves, to have something interesting and positive to put our creativity and our mind in so we're still growing and just nurturing who we are. Because here's that thing, because I think the interesting thing about the last chapter I wrote about your Aunt Doe was just how everyone just stopped after her death because their identity had been so wrapped up in the caregiving season for your family. But afterwards, it's like, what's left? And so, as an entrepreneur, there's going to be seasons of where you're going to have many types of caregiving, your children, your spouse, maybe yourself if you have chronic illnesses like I do, or again, like statistically, we all will go through at some point an aging parent, aging grandparent, or like in your case, Natasha, multiple aging family members that are like great aunts, great uncles, grandparents,
Mhm.
great grandparents. It's going to happen at some point. We just don't know when. So,
Yeah.
still have, I think it's so important to just keep that in mind in the limelight is still keep nurturing your passions that you're passionate about because you will want to lean into them and you will need to lean into them later once this X, Y, and Z season has passed.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think as a caregiver, you can really get lost in, or as an entrepreneur, either or, right? As an athlete. I mean, this could be for a variety of identities, but sometimes we get very lost in what this one identity is, and it becomes everything to us. And I know, and I reflect on this in the book that my mom in particular, after my grandma died, my mom was her primary caregiver. And when she died, my mom truly, and my brother and I were adults at that point, so she didn't need to take care of us as much anymore. And so my grandma really was her main focus. And when that goes away, it is incredibly challenging to know who you are. And so that is something, again, that I talk about a lot, whether you are an athlete, whether you are a physician, whether you are an entrepreneur, whether you are a full-time caregiver, you do have to recognize that there is more to you than just that one role. And I encourage people to not just remind themselves of that, but to live out some of those things and make sure you're still putting energy into some of those other aspects of your identity, because it makes these transitions a lot easier when you know who else you are, what else is important to you, and you're just more prepared, I think, to deal with some of the change that comes when a dominant identity shifts for whatever reason. You retire, somebody dies, you some sort of pivot in your life.
Absolutely. And I want to say too, because this has been interesting, at least for me, is that sometimes pursuing those other potential passions can also be healing. My father, like I said, was a pastor, and so following his death, I had been, or excuse me, prior to his death, I had been volunteering in our preschool and kindergarten program because that's the age my daughter is right now. And after he died, I continued to, and then within the past few months, our children's pastor was like, "Hey, we have our main teacher stepping down. Could you take over because
Mhm.
you've been at least helping, you are in the headspace of the program, and that way I wouldn't have to train somebody from scratch. And I was like, yeah, I'd love it because I've been enjoying it. And also too, it's been and but the interesting part has been I have felt so connected to my father because he was a
Yeah.
pastor, but his other passion was the children. Whenever we had a vacation Bible school, or our at one church, I remember we had a Wednesday afternoon after school program for 3 or 4 hours until their kids got off work, and he was always in charge of the PE games. And so growing up, I forever remember it drove my mother to distraction. All these little games, he'd be creating games like getting going to Costco and buying those big, like huge trash cans to like make baskets or something or do some sort of game and taking big gallon size trash bags to and lining them with doing all sorts of things. And so it's been
Yeah.
interesting as I've been now that being a main teacher in our Wednesday night program at our church, it feels like it's come full circle. I'm never going to go to pastorate and get my doctorate and be a pastor. That's not my calling. I'm more passionate about sharing my healthcare knowledge to help entrepreneurs learn how to be caregivers. But I think but I do want to say, I think you should be open to that. Realize that pursuing passions is good for you and it can be good for you in multiple ways, not only in helping you, like we were talking about with establishing multiple identities. So when one season is over, like you say, Natasha, you don't forget who else you are. You're more than just a wife, a mother, a caregiver. Okay, or an
Totally.
entrepreneur. You are also maybe an artist, or maybe you're an avid book
Yeah.
reader, or you like to if you or maybe you volunteer in a different capacity, maybe at your senior center, or another organization that you're or top that you're passionate about. Sorry, I can't talk, guys. Passionate about. So, and realize too that, or maybe it is something like what I do with the children's program that is tied to something that your loved one was passionate about with. And so, carrying on the torch that way and honoring them in another way can not only help bring closure to that caregiving side, but also empower you and bring healing and just feel like some connectedness to that. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. I think another angle from this too is just the idea that if you are filling up your cup, you are going to be a better caregiver or a better entrepreneur or a better athlete or whatever it is. This is a concept that I use with my athletes a lot because sometimes they feel like, well, I just need to practice more. I just need to train all the time and I need to do extra workouts. And I need to always be training my body. And I really like to help them take a step back and look at their whole life and look at how sleep is a part of their training plan. Nutrition is a part of their training plan. Meeting with me is a part of their training plan. So they are still training and working and getting better at their performance and at their craft by filling up their cup in other ways. Being with friends, being in a relationship, staying connected to family, enjoying other things, all of that, right? That disconnection, that ability to kind of step away from your main gig makes you better at your main gig, right? It's allowing you to just kind of generate some new energy and step away and, like I said, fill your cup up. And I think oftentimes that is really challenging as a caregiver to do. And again, I reference this in the book quite a bit as well. As people become sicker and decline more time and more energy is needed in that space, but it's still incredibly crucial to let go of a little bit of control and use other resources and support so that you can be your best self in whatever that role is in that moment.
Right. And this is so, yeah. And I talk about this a lot, mind, body, soul, so in my prompt framework, the second P in prompt is, prioritize your whole body self-care. So mind, body, soul. So obviously as human beings that need nutrition, we need enough sleep, so I definitely look at as well, look like, are you getting enough sleep, are you drinking enough water, are you getting some movement, even if it's just 15 to 20 minutes a day, is are you are you giving mental help in terms of, do you need to see a counselor, like say like Natasha, or maybe more on the spiritual side, are you in a place where you're feeling kind of dark and doubting your faith and you're needing some extra encouragement? So maybe joining a small group Bible study in your church, or having a one-on-one meeting with your pastor because it's more private and you feel more comfortable talking one-on-one with someone that's a senior faith leader. Or maybe it is a support group with other people. Where can you find your people? That's the big thing. Where can you find your people so you are surrounded? Because that is a part of filling your cup, of feeling like you have community. Because I know another thing in your book that I noticed is that you struggled with, so a lot of your family members dealt with the problem of just being isolated, feeling alone. Like, here is this big life altering change or event in my life, but I have no way to know how to express it. I don't have those skills, for one. And then the other
Yeah.
component is I don't know who to talk to. How do I,
Yes.
so part of filling your
Yes.
cup is building what I call it is your support network. But also too, filling your cup is to getting enough sleep, getting enough nutrition, movement, spiritual support, mental, emotional support, and then also just creative support. Again, like I like to knit. I've been knitting since I was 10. I love to knit baby blankets for friends and family who are expecting. So that fell by the wayside after my husband got sick because of, we just had our daughter, we're in the pandemic. I didn't focus on it, but I'm getting back into it now. And it's been very refreshing to do that again. So it's a whole, I know there's so much that goes into this topic in terms of self-care to help to manage grief in a healthy way, but it's so important, guys. And obviously, if you're feeling overwhelmed, even just by starting, maybe just start with one thing. Maybe out of the physical aspect, maybe it's just starting to get consistent with a consistent bedtime and wake up time, or maybe getting a reusable water bottle so you can just really chug that water throughout the day to stay hydrated. Maybe in the mental space, maybe it is finally being brave and saying, you know what, I'm struggling. I'm just feeling extra anxiety and stress right now. And so maybe it is having a conversation with their primary doctor about recommendations for maybe a counselor or for maybe light medication. I personally have dealt with high anxiety since I was a kid. And for a time, I did have to go on medication, lorazepam, a light dose. And I don't currently take anything now, but because I have other coping techniques. But that season, I'm so glad I did because it was just at a critical point in my life where I just couldn't function. It was hard to function. So, and then maybe in the supportive space, maybe it is talking with your pastor, talking or looking at a support group or something. And it doesn't have to be in person. Guys, a lot of my stuff is remote because I am a caregiver too, and I'm a stay-at-home mom, and I'm busy, and sometimes it's tough for me to leave my husband unattended because I know him so well. So think about that too with your situation. Every situation's different. So maybe it's going to be a blend of remote. Maybe it's going to be a blend of in person. Or I know, like with some people who may be caring for cancer patients, their immune system is shot. So it's not. So maybe leaning into more remote stuff. Even Facebook, guys. There's a lot more in the limelight of the pandemic. I've seen a lot more groups pop up for caregiving, for just dealing with entrepreneurship. Or maybe stress and anxiety. You type that keyword in, I'm sure you will find something. And for me, honestly, I haven't found one particularly that works for me, and that's fine. But maybe for you, it does, with needing to do that more remote aspect of not of protecting yourself, protecting your loved one's immune system, and being home full time. So,
Yeah,
and
I
yeah,
also think while we're on this topic, it's important to also mention that sometimes it isn't about doing something, sometimes it is being. I talk about this a lot, the difference between doing and being. And there are some things, particularly in the grief realm, that we can't do our way out of. We have to be with it, we have to sit with the feelings, we have to go through it. And oftentimes with grief, those things never really go away. In some ways, they become companions, right? Not necessarily companions that we would want, but they are always there. And so I think that's a really important message to send too. It isn't always just about filling up your schedule and going and doing all these things and trying all these things. Sometimes it really is being. It is being with yourself. It is being still. It is being silent. It is just allowing yourself to exist without feeling like you have to be productive or do something to pull yourself out of whatever you're feeling in that moment, because oftentimes we need to just be with that feeling in that moment and allow it to kind of, wash over us. As I often talk about, grief can come in waves, and to let it do its thing and kind of move forward. So I think that's an important component
right.
for
And
people to remember
yeah,
too.
absolutely. And going along with that, I would want to say, guys, too, God gave us emotions. We have anger, we have sad, we have tears, we have um frustration. They're emotions that we were given. Obviously, yet again, it's important that we channel them in a healthy way, but sometimes we might need to just go into a room, shut the door, and cry and have a good
Right,
cry to really to process it. Maybe it
right.
is out of, we don't want to shout at our kids or our spouse. So maybe it is just having a notebook for those days when we need to vent and maybe a cursing mode. I'm a Christian, but still, you can have moments where you're like, oh, I just need to get this out. You just need to write it out in a book so you get it out of somewhere. If you don't want to necessarily say it to a person, at least say it, you know, maybe go to your car and say it and shout for like do a 5 minute vent, or maybe it's writing it in a journal.
Sure.
Whatever you
Yeah.
need to do, whatever you need to do to let it out,
I talk
please let it out.
about
Yeah.
I talk about this idea of externalizing, right? So it doesn't necessarily need to be with another person, but it's just some way to externalize and kind of get it out of yourself. So that way it's not just bouncing around in your head, kind of trapped in there, but how can you just release it in whatever way works for you? And that doesn't always need to be with another person. It can be solo as well.
Yeah. And, going along with grief too, what comes up to me thinking about some of your relatives that passed too and the situations that put the family into is just not feeling prepared to handle it. That was another grief, the grief of not being prepared, of not having a will, not having a power of attorney, not knowing what their final wishes were for their funeral service, or how they wanted to be buried. Do they even want a
Right.
memorial service? Who do they want to be their
Right.
power of attorney? How did they want to go? Die at home or in the hospital? I know these are
Yeah.
uncomfortable conversations to have, but I want to empower you that planning ahead is another for, or not being prepared. And, there's that grief. That was definitely something that just hit me when I was reading the chapter with your Aunt Doe, because I was thankful that my dad had within the last 6 months of his life, we got my name on the bills, so I could
Right.
transition into ownership because I inherited the house. We got our a current power of attorney and living will done. My dad had done one 2 or 3 years prior to when he passed away, but the information on it was not accurate because it still listed my mother, because at that time my mother was still alive. And then there was also too, like even the last living will and testament. Now that one he should have maybe touched on then, but the 3 years prior to his death, but he didn't. And so when I finally got around to looking at it, was notarized. Not even it wasn't even notarized in our state. And it was done back when I was a minor, like when I was 5 or 6 years old. And so I had to
Yeah.
go through and actually make phone calls to relatives like, okay, you're listed as this, but would you like me to change that? Yes,
Yeah.
please,
Yeah. I
Melissa,
gotta
please do that.
update.
Yeah,
Gotta
so
update.
yeah, it can so just be aware grief isn't again the changes or excuse me, grief can be changes, it can be losing somebody or some other or loss of innocence with some traumatic horrible experience. But it also can be just not being prepared. And so to allow yourself the breathing room to actually grieve when your loved one goes, whether you're prepared, you're anticipating it or not, definitely do take the time to get prepared. So have those hard questions. It doesn't have to be all at once, but maybe just break it down. Like, if ask them maybe today, what do you want to do for a burial service? Do you even want one? Do you want to be cremated? You don't have, maybe just do a question at a time. And at least by starting and doing a little bit at a time, you're getting there. You're getting everything ironed out so you're prepared. And also remember too, decisions aren't life sentences. So if something changes, you can go, it's much easier to go back and edit a document than panic hitting the panic button when things happen and you're not prepared and you
Yeah.
don't have a document at all. So like for
Yeah.
example, my husband and I, we've done our living wills, but we've at least started, but we still need to go back and add stuff. But at least we have peace of mind knowing that something for right now is documented, so we have something.
And I very much encourage people to have those conversations. They are not pleasant. They are not desirable. I've never had a great time talking about those things, but they are important and they are necessary. And I think they really help us move a little bit more towards acceptance of death as a reality that we all have to go through. And I think that acknowledging that and moving into it, again, leaning into it, not avoiding it, allows us to live more fully because we know that grief is going to happen. We know that death and loss are going to happen. And when we know those things and when we work on accepting them, we don't, and acceptance doesn't mean you have to like them or doesn't mean that you have to agree with them. But I think when you do have those hard conversations, it just makes life a little bit easier. I will often talk to people about the zoom in, zoom out approach. And I think this piece is just so key because you do need to kind of zoom out, see big picture, think about what you might want for your future and plan to a certain extent. And at the same time, we know that life is uncertain and some things will happen. And sometimes plans that we have will fall apart or will have to be modified. So then we can kind of zoom in and see what's going on right now. And I think that also provides, again, coming back to this idea of balance, it allows us to feel somewhat secure and that we've had these conversations and we know what the future may bring and how we want to deal with that. But we're also not so catastrophically anxious and thinking about the future that it takes us away from today. And so I just love that kind of visual of zoom in, zoom out, because that is a delicate dance that we have to perform throughout our lives.
No, I love that. I love that. Zoom in and zoom out. So you're still trying to, it really helps you assess the situation, zoom out, see the full picture. So like in this case, knowing, oh, I don't have a living will. I haven't vocalized, I haven't done a living will. I haven't even just at least vocalized to family members what my wishes are. I haven't created a power of attorney. I don't have life insurance, okay, the zoom out, I need to look at the full picture. But then once I've maybe gotten some of those things in place, I can zoom back in and go like, okay, in this season, okay, still got to get my kids to school. I still got to pay rent. I still got to do the
Right,
kind of the in
exactly.
this season of life struggles. But at the same time, in the back of my mind, when you zoom out, you have, and also even just in the present, you just have that peace of mind. Okay, whenever it happens, I'm not anxious that it's going to happen like, oh, tomorrow, like, oh, I live in fear. But you have that peace of mind and knowing like when we get to that season, I won't have that stress of not being prepared. And it can also
Yeah.
give your loved one peace of mind too. Just knowing that we had everything to go. I think that was definitely the case. I remember with my father, like towards the end, he was thankful that we had things in place, that we knew what to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very important. Yeah, and again, it's not easy. It's not easy to talk about these conversations. As a former healthcare worker, there were so many times it would be heartbreaking to tell family, your loved one's declining, and we don't have much time. And even when we get to that stage, that piece hit me too. Like when you in that chapter when your Aunt Doe passed, where family were asking, "Do we have time to go home and shower?" And,
Right.
and she said, I think you have an hour or two. But again, as healthcare workers, we're not God. We do, we're trained to kind of pay attention to the signs of when the body's shutting down. But again, it's different for everybody. It's different for
Yeah.
everybody. I've seen people hang on till like their family member came back to say goodbye, then they went. And then I've had other situations where they thought they had weeks, they were gone within an 8-hour shift. So it's
Right.
very unpredictable. We can't control it. Um, but and it's hard. It's hard. Grief is not an easy thing. End of life is not an easy subject. It is not easy to deal with change, whether we anticipate or not, whether it's grief change or other job change, any kind of change. As human beings, we do not like change. We
Well, it's
like,
hard. It's
yeah, we like
hard.
consistency. We like consistency,
I
and
think that was a
it's
huge
hard.
reason why I wanted to write the book, right? Because we do grieve all sorts of other things. And so, yeah, I think you described this a little bit earlier, but each chapter of the book is focused on a different type of loss. And then it crafts a narrative, right? So I go back and I really tell you what happened. And then the second part of each chapter, I kind of synthesize information, right? So I use my experience as a psychologist and the education and the research. And I don't write it in an academic way, right? I'm not citing research, but I infuse a lot of concepts and knowledge within my areas of expertise to kind of help people understand how does people grieve. And it's not a how-to book, but just showing there's so many vastly different ways to go about it and helping people understand how grief shows up and where it shows up. And I think that is so powerful because whether it's death or non-death, we are all grieving and losing things, and life transitions that's one of the biggest ways that we do that. And I talk a lot about the idea of gains and losses, right? Any life event we experience, whether it's desirable or undesirable, and I'm very careful with those terms to not use positive and negative, but whether it's
Yeah,
desirable or undesirable, uh, there are going to be gains and losses associated with that, right? So
absolutely.
in many ways, having an end of life discussion with your family, there are a lot of losses to that. It is sad. You are anticipating grief. You are just feeling very uncomfortable. You are thinking into the future, and it is dark and it is scary. So there's a lot of losses to having those conversations because it hurts. But man, there are also gains to having those conversations because you do feel a little bit more prepared and you do feel a little bit more connected and you are a little bit more aware and you have sat with really uncomfortable feelings. And that is really good for your evolvement as a human being. So, whether it's desirable or undesirable, I really encourage people to look and hold both the gains and the losses at the same time. And I think zooming in and zooming out can also make that process a little bit easier, but I just think we cope more effectively when we're able to do that.
Yeah, like, the zoom out, like, looking at the big picture, but then not being, but then also being able to zoom in, like, okay, is this something that really is affecting me now? That's going to, in fact, if I make a choice now, will it affect me later? Is it that,
Yeah.
how extreme is it? And so zooming in and zooming out, I think, is a great tool. So I hope I'm definitely going to work on using that. That's awesome. And then also too, I think just acceptance. But then the other word that I've read in a lot of the chapters, the theme is, the unhealthy aspect of not dealing with grief in a healthy way or preparing yourself to deal with grief in a healthy way is denial. Denial is not a
Yeah.
good way. It doesn't because again, going back to the chapter with Anto, I'm sorry, this chapter just really stuck out to me in so many ways. But yeah, guys, read the whole book. All the chapters are good. They don't get me wrong. Every story, I promise you, will give you an insight to grief in different ways and will help you. And obviously, for those of you reading, you're going to connect with things in a different way than I probably do. So, but definitely get it. It's so good. So, but anyway, back to the conversation. But yeah, I think it was so sad. I felt so bad for your family when I was reading the chapter with Aunt Doe where she was totally in denial about, but yet you guys, and that because of her denial, it was tough double edged for you. You guys were just struggling with your matriarch just declining and just anticipating that grief and all the changes with your family
Right.
culture that her death would put into effect. But then also too, it put you in a place that was hard as a caregiver to advocate for her. You realize, okay, she's in denial, she's not telling us information, or maybe
Yeah.
because of her the rapid progression of her liver shutting down, she's not thinking clearly anyway. So we're not getting straight answers. So then you
Right.
had to step into
Right.
that segue of like, okay, doc, what is actually going on? Like, where are we at with her labs? What do we need to do with her meds? Things like that. And that's
Yeah.
hard. That's hard when you have someone that's not on the page with you coherently, or even just, or maybe if they are coherent, but
Yeah.
they just can't accept it. They can't get to that point of dealing with grief and anticipating grief
Yes.
in a healthy way. They're in that denial phase. And that makes
Yeah.
it tough for you guys. I could reading that chapter, I could tell you guys were just skating. You guys were really skating that fine line of trying to balance of being respectful to your elder, which is part of your culture, which I understand, but then also
Hmm.
like, but this is our loved one. We want to make her
Yeah.
as comfortable as
Yeah.
possible and do what we need to do. And, you guys were
Yes.
researching and doing the information, getting the information from the doctors and going like, okay, what do we need to do? What can we do? Or what's an alternative? Okay, she's not going for this. What can we try? And then she's in flat denial and not having any of it.
Yeah. And again, gains and losses, oh man, I miss her, you know, and she had so many great qualities. And I loved how bullheaded she was. And she was like, I'm going to beat this and I got this. She was very courageous and very independent and very strong willed. So there was some serious gains for me to be able to see that and to, want to emulate some of those characteristics as I continue to grow up and age. But my goodness, it was also very frustrating and very hard. And she was very stubborn and all of those things exist at the same time. And I just think we have to look at the full picture when we look at people in our lives and be able to hold kind of the duality that exists and work through it as best as we can.
And the choices they make. My dad, he loved Dr. Pepper. Like to the hilt. That was his favorite thing. And towards the end of his life, his doctor told him that, you should stop drinking Dr. Pepper because it's, really hard on your body. It's not helping. But what am I going to do? I mean, as his daughter, same thing. I want him to be, and with
Right.
my healthcare bring, I want him to be hydrated. I'd rather him push more water, but what are you going to tell a 70 plus year old man? Like, I'm not going to treat him
Absolutely.
like a little
Yeah.
kid and say like, oh, no, you cannot have that. I'm going to take that away from you. So what do you do?
Yep.
I got to the point where, like, I may not agree with that decision because I want to prolong his life and make sure he's healthy as his caregiver and his daughter. But at the same time, with that dual role of being a caregiver is like, the patient is always right, just like in customer service, the customer is always right. So there's that element of surrender and acceptance where I have to say, okay, I don't personally love this decision you're making, but I have to respect it. And
Yeah.
same thing as his daughter. It's like, he's my father. He was my father. I love him. I miss him dearly. Same thing, but at the same time, it's like, enjoy your Dr. Pepper.
Yes.
So yeah, so there's gonna be that you're gonna probably run into that as well, guys. There's not there's that's the other thing too. Control. There's not
Take your
a lot you can always control. We can't control how fast your loved one's illness is going to progress. We cannot control what their response is going to be. If the chapter about Ando is any indication, we can't control what they're going to decide to do when they are told uh, about changes in their illness, whether it's good or bad. If their illness is progressing, we can't control that. But what we can control is how we deal with it. Because
Yep.
because here's the twofold thing: how you choose to respond to the situation does impact those people around you. Now, obviously, I noticed with a lot of the chapters too in your book, unfortunately, because a lot of your family, which is not totally 100% their fault, they didn't have the skills, generations of not being taught
Right.
healthy, sustainable coping techniques to deal with grief was the problem. And it wasn't their fault. It's generations that have just passed down. When you only know
Yep.
one way, there is no other way. And so
Yep.
that's what they go to. But also too, there's that element of choice of being accepted, of being able to accept, okay, I know I've been taught one way, but oh, okay, maybe there is another way. And am I open to go down that road, even if it means feeling uncomfortable and having to face some really hard things um, on the flip side of that? And with all your family members that are still there that haven't been able to get there yet, my heart goes out for them. And I
Right.
hope
Yeah.
that they will get to that point because I agree with you, not I don't want to use the word potential, but I hope they have the chance to work through it in a healthy way and have that piece of of being on the flip side of that pain because it's so sad and I can't imagine. It's so sad to hear that they've had to go through what they've had to go through for one, but the fact that they didn't get the chance to they haven't gotten the chance yet to really see the other flip side of that there is a way to work through it. It's going to be painful and it's going to be hard, but it's still possible and that it's not their fault.
Well, and I hope that's one of the greatest gifts from the book is I rehashed all of that with my family, right? And we talked about it and they've read the chapter and so in many ways I asked their permission and they gave permission to really sit and process and move through some of that stuff that we really haven't touched since some of these events have happened and some of these events are 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting too, when you're thinking about, I mean, obviously, when we think about grief, it can be very individualistic, but like from your journey, family dynamic. I come from a big family too. Very, I wouldn't say we have a big cultural thing like you do with your Spanish roots. Um, but I will say, being an Orthodox Christian family, Quaker family, leaning into our faith has definitely how we've gotten through,
Yes,
and just how we deal with trauma. And so when you're looking at
for
it, it has to be
sure.
from the standpoint of the culture. So, but
Well, and that's such
yeah.
an individualized thing too, right? Because there's a degree to which all of us may or may not connect with a certain religion or spirituality, and that's
Hmm.
really hard when it's all within one family.
Hmm.
but we all have different beliefs or different viewpoints. So
True.
again, I think it just speaks to the individualized nature of, so yes, we have these cultural dynamics, but there's a lot of individual differences within that too, and that can really complicate grief
Yeah.
and decision making and communication and emotions and
Yeah,
the list.
that can really be make it tricky too when because of the culture aspect, they're used to one way of thinking too. And like, like, oh, we do not do this. This is a big no-no. That makes it hard
Yeah.
too. It's like, but it's not, yeah, yeah. But anyway, Natasha, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the Caregiving and Entrepreneurship Reimagined podcast. It has been a true delight. Where can people find more Tasha if or Natasha if they're interested in learning more about your work, and just wanting to connect with you?
Yeah. So my private practice website is npttherapy.com. And then you can learn more about the book at andshewasneverthesameagain.com. It's currently for sale on Amazon and through my website. And then it's also audiobook now. So you can get that on Amazon, Audible, and Apple if you are an audiobook fan. And then we just got it up onto Ingram Spark too. So now more independent bookstores and things like that can start to purchase and get it in
Yay.
house. So if anyone has local bookstores, yeah, please let people know. And then, of course, I've got some social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. My handle on Instagram is at NPT Therapy. And then just my name, Natasha P. Trujillo, PhD for LinkedIn and Facebook.
All right. Well, all that information will be in the description below, whether you're watching it on my blog, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, it'll all be there. So definitely check out the links below and definitely be sure to tune in and check out another episode of the Caregiving and Entrepreneurship Reimagined podcast. So thank you, Natasha, and thank you guys for listening and watching. See you in the next one.
Yeah.